A flight attendant tried to unbuckle a baby mid-takeoff, but the father acted decisively, removing him from the airline and shocking everyone on board. A flight attendant removed the baby's seatbelt mid-takeoff, thinking no one would notice. He didn't realize the father was already in control, ready to remove him from the airline entirely. The moment that buckle clicked open, the cabin's power dynamics flipped. Subscribe if you believe arrogance collapses the instant true authority rises. The moment the aircraft began to surge down the runway, Darren Velrock felt it, a ripple of something unnatural, coiled beneath the smooth hum of acceleration. He tightened his hold on the baby seatbelt, confirming Riven's strap again with the practiced precision of a man who solved problems for a living. His left hand hovered near the edge of the infant carrier, as if his reflexes didn't trust the system around him. He wasn't wrong. Just then, a figure stepped into the aisle. The flight attendant, tall, rigid, with an unreadable half-smile, approached without hesitation. His name tag read Merrick Vaughn, and his demeanor was a study in unnatural calm. With the plane still in its takeoff roll and the cabin rattling faintly from wind pressure, Merrick leaned in. "I'll just adjust this for you," he said too casually, his voice low but rehearsed. Before Darren could react, Merrick's fingers snapped open the infant's belt. For half a second, time fractured. The jolt of the aircraft's wheels leaving the tarmac synced perfectly with the click of the unfastened belt. Riven teetered in his seat, his small frame wobbling under the force of acceleration. Darren moved instantly, scooping him into his chest and locking both arms around him in one swift, trained motion. He didn't shout, he didn't curse, but his eyes burned with disbelief. "What are you doing?" he asked, voice firm but even, refusing to let emotion cloud his question. Merrick didn't blink. The restraint wasn't aligned to policy, just correcting it. "It was secure," Darren said. "I checked it twice." Merrick shrugged, already scribbling something on a tablet he pulled from his side holster. "Safety comes first." The turbulence struck lightly then, as if on cue. Darren instinctively braced himself and his child, but what shook him more was not the jolt of the aircraft, but the way Merrick walked off with absolute composure, as if the removal of a baby's seatbelt mid-takeoff was standard practice. It wasn't. Darren's mind began to spin, not in panic, but in rapid calculation. Something was off. From the moment he had boarded Aeronex Flight 719, he had noticed the strange energy in the cabin. The crew moved like chess pieces on pre-scripted patterns. Eyes flicked too often in his direction. And now this, an unprovoked safety breach disguised as protocol. He scanned the aisle behind Merrick, noticing a subtle exchange. A nod from another male flight attendant stationed at the galley, who responded silently into his earpiece. Darren's instincts screamed. This wasn't random. But what could it be? Darren was no stranger to manipulation. As a systems engineer in high-stakes negotiations, he'd spent the past week across boardrooms studying risk vectors, analyzing failure points, and modeling crisis scenarios. He recognized tension. He could feel patterns hiding beneath surface chaos, and this felt like a pattern. He shifted Riven gently in his arms, whispered softly to calm him, then secured the infant against his chest with his jacket wrapped tightly for warmth and support. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, part of the ascent routine, but Darren's thoughts didn't dim with them. They sharpened. What would cause a flight attendant to interfere with an infant's restraint at the most dangerous point of takeoff? It wasn't incompetence. Merrick's movements had been too precise. It wasn't curiosity. He hadn't looked at Riven, hadn't acknowledged the child. It was something else. Darren leaned his head back but kept his eyes half open, scanning for additional patterns. The man across the aisle was asleep, or pretending to be. The crew had stopped walking the cabin. Even the PA system was silent longer than normal. Then it clicked. Darren remembered a research article he'd once skimmed during a design audit. Behavioral stress tests in transit environments. Most were simulations. But what if this wasn't? What if this flight had been co-opted, by some private contractor, by internal training operations, or worse, for live scenario observation. He reached down discreetly and tapped his wristband's embedded chip, activating the backup audio log. A light blinked briefly before vanishing. The mic was recording now. If this was a test, it was no longer theoretical. They had chosen the wrong subject. Or, perhaps, the perfect one. In row 11C, with a child in his arms and a head full of silent questions, Darn Velrock stopped thinking like a passenger and started analyzing like an engineer under siege. His goal remained the same: get his son home safely. But now, someone had turned that mission into a threat, and the moment the plane began its takeoff roll, Merrick leaned in with a forced smile, setting the first piece of the planned provocation into motion. Something here was waiting to happen. The moment the aircraft lifted from the runway and the landing gear clunked into its compartment, Merrick moved. With precision that could only come from rehearsal, he approached row 14, where Darren Velrock sat cradling his infant son. Without a word, without hesitation, the attendant bent at the waist and reached for the infant's lap belt. In a single flick of his fingers, the belt came undone. Darren's mind blanked. For one terrible second, his thoughts didn't know how to arrange themselves. Had that just happened? Was that real? The plane jolted slightly as it climbed into initial turbulence, and Riven, freed from his restraint, tilted with the motion. Darren's arms reacted before his mind could. He gripped his son tightly, pulling him close to his chest, his left hand cradling the back of the child's fragile head. Riven stirred, but didn't cry. Darren's breath caught in his throat. Merrick rose casually as if he'd only adjusted a tray table. His tablet clicked beneath his fingers, stylus scratching across the screen. His expression remained disturbingly calm, neutral even, but his eyes darted for a moment toward the galley before returning to Darren. That flicker told Darren more than any words could. "What are you doing?" Darren asked, voice low but edged with steel. "The restraint wasn't properly fastened," Merrick replied smoothly, like he'd said it 100 times before. "Per airline policy, I had to make sure it met standard." "It was fastened," Darren said firmly, adjusting his grip on Riven without taking his eyes off the man. "I checked it twice." Merrick simply nodded once, then turned on his heel. No apology, no further explanation, just a brisk retreat as if nothing had happened. But something had. Darren could feel it, not just the unfastening of a buckle, but the unraveling of something deeper. A routine flight had shifted in tone. The moment Merrick's fingers had touched the buckle, a line had been crossed, and the air around it trembled with consequence. He sat still, mind recalibrating. His instincts, honed from years of risk modeling and crisis response, surged awake. Something was being set in motion. This wasn't random turbulence. This wasn't clumsiness. This was provocation. He scanned the cabin. 2 rows back, a man with a shaved head and a charcoal-colored jacket subtly shifted a phone mounted on a seat handle. It clicked as if beginning a recording. Darren didn't miss it. Just as he didn't miss the small nod Merrick gave another attendant near the galley, a man with a tall, lean build and a crew badge that read, "Hail." Their eyes met for half a second, and Hale tapped a panel beside the beverage station, glancing at the rows with far too much interest for someone preparing coffee. Darren's heart rate ticked upward. His breathing slowed intentionally, a method he'd trained himself to use in high-stress situations. Think. Don't react. Anticipate. He turned his wrist slightly, activating the discreet mic embedded in his wristband. It hummed once beneath the surface of the skin, a silent acknowledgement that it was now recording. Not just ambient noise, but everything. He adjusted Riven's blanket slowly, shielding the child's face from sudden motion. All the while, his thoughts sharpened around one fact. Someone wanted a reaction. That meant the most dangerous thing he could do now was give them one. The plane's climb stabilized. The overhead chime rang out. The lights dimmed subtly into cabin cruise mode. But Darren wasn't at ease. He was tracking every variable, The timing of movements, the flow of foot traffic, the oddly measured pauses of turbulence that seemed to coincide with Merrick's walk cycles. Riven shifted slightly, one small hand fisting into Darren's shirt. The boy's warmth grounded him, but also lit a fire beneath his control. Whoever was orchestrating this didn't just threaten him, they'd risked the safety of an infant. That wasn't training error. That was moral blindness. He moved his phone, now tucked between the seat cushions at an angle, aligning the camera toward his lap in the area where Merrick had reached. The angle was discreet but wide enough. If it happened again, the footage would be undeniable. Another glance revealed that Merrick had returned to the galley but was speaking into a short comlink at his collar, his back partially turned but posture relaxed. Too relaxed. It was the calm of a man who thought he was ahead of the script. And perhaps he was. Until now. Darren wasn't going to wait for the next strike. He was preparing for it. Moments later, Merrick stepped forward again, moving with that same artificial casualness, stylus in hand and a bland expression that felt more like a mask than a face. Darren tensed slightly, not out of fear, but readiness. Riven slept quietly against his chest, utterly unaware of the games being played around him. Merrick slowed as he passed, lingering for a moment by Darren's armrest. "Just doing a quick compliance check," he said blandly, eyes flicking toward the buckle again. Darren didn't move. "Everything's secure." "That's for us to verify, sir," Merrick replied, reaching subtly toward the seatbelt once more. And there it was. The repeat attempt. Not blatant, not forceful. Just enough to justify a check, just enough to provoke. Darren lifted his forearm, not striking, not even touching, just placing it between Merrick's hand and the buckle. "No," he said, calm, direct, absolute. For a brief instant, Merrick's expression faltered. The smile cracked, revealing the irritation underneath, but he recovered quickly, drawing his hand back. "Very well," he muttered, scribbling something again. But Darren had seen it. The crack in the mask. The edge of frustration that exposed intent. He watched Merrick walk away, this time a little faster, his eyes no longer neutral. This wasn't going to stop. Darren shifted in his seat, adjusted the camera angle again, and breathed slowly through his nose. His body was calm, but his mind was assembling a wall of precision, preparing for what came next. He no longer saw this as a misunderstanding. Not after the nods, not after the targeted belt removal, not after the way turbulence timed itself to confrontation. No, something was happening here, something that had nothing to do with safety, and everything to do with control. And as Merrick disappeared into the galley again, a smirk playing faintly across his lips, Darren knew it in his bones. The moment the seatbelt clicked open, the entire flight shifted into a threat. The moment Merrick Vaughn returned to Darren's row, the cabin had settled into an eerie quiet, seatbelt signs off, tray tables still stowed, engines humming with cruising altitude steadiness. But beneath the calm, Darren could feel it. The pressure hadn't lifted. It had shifted. Merrick approached slowly this time, the smile gone, replaced with a more performative concern. "Sir," he said, voice low but clear enough for nearby passengers to hear. "We've had a report you may be holding your child too tightly. I need to ensure the baby is safe." Darren blinked. The words were absurd, but the delivery was deliberate. He adjusted Riven in his arms, keeping his tone neutral. "He's fine, secure, calm. There's no issue." Merrick didn't argue. He didn't have to. He gave a subtle nod, as if acknowledging Darren's restraint was just one more item on a checklist, and stepped away. But as he passed the galley, Darren caught the moment when Merrick's eyes met those of another flight attendant. Corvin Hale stood rigid beside the galley wall, his hands near a small control panel mounted discreetly between beverage trays. He wasn't organizing drinks. He was watching. Darren's instinct activated like a reflex. Corvin glanced briefly toward Merrick, then back to the panel, typing something swiftly. A soft click followed, and Darren noticed the row indicator lights overhead blink for a split second. Nothing passengers would catch unless they were looking for it. Darren was. He recognized the rhythm of it, the back-and-forth glances, the subtle physical cues between crew members. It reminded him of old tactical drills he had studied during his work in system behavior analysis. Only here, it felt sinister. The actions weren't random. They were coordinated. He shifted Riven's blanket gently, using the movement to disguise a sideways glance. His gaze swept the cabin. The man in seat 18D, 2 rows behind, had a small device angled oddly, likely a phone, possibly recording. Another passenger was pretending to sleep, but his ears twitched with each interaction near Darren's seat. It felt as though the plane was watching him, studying his every move. A small jolt of turbulence rocked the plane, not enough to worry most passengers, but Darren's mind caught the pattern. The same thing had happened earlier, right after Merrick's first provocation. Now again, after another crew interaction. Too coincidental. The turbulence was pulsed, not prolonged, short bursts that framed the moments Merrick engaged him. It had the feel of a controlled environment, like a stage built for emotional testing. Darren didn't react. Not outwardly. He couldn't afford to. He needed proof. Carefully, using his forearm to cradle Riven closer, he shifted the baby's blanket slightly upward, not just to keep him warm, but to provide cover. With a flick of his thumb, he angled his phone in the seat pocket to face forward, securing it behind the mesh. The camera lens now had a clean shot of the seatbelt area and the aisle where Merrick had approached. He double-checked the angle through the reflection in his screen. Perfect. No longer was this about getting through the flight. Now he had to build a record. It had become a surveillance operation, but not his. Theirs. And the only way to fight surveillance was to document back. Jalen Trask, the man in the aisle seat across from him, looked over again. This time his expression was different, torn between fear and something resembling guilt. He opened his mouth slightly, then closed it, retreating into silence. Darren didn't press him. Fear made people hesitate, but he logged the detail. Everything counted. From the corner of his eye, he saw Merrick return. The flight attendant didn't speak this time. Instead, he leaned forward under the guise of checking seatbelt compliance again, but this time, his fingers moved deliberately toward the buckle. Darren's body shifted slightly, fluid and calm as he raised his hand, not striking, just interposing. "I'll ask you not to touch my child again," he said, his voice firm but low enough not to startle Riven. "There is no safety concern here." Merrick froze for a half-second. The performance slipped. Behind him, Corvin Hale was already moving down the aisle. This wasn't improvisation. It was escalation. Corvin's tone was louder, official. "Sir, I need you to comply. Interfering with cabin crew is a violation of—" "I'm not interfering," Darren interrupted, standing slowly with Riven in his arms. "I'm protecting my child. You've approached multiple times without cause, and I've documented every instance." His voice wasn't raised, but it cut through the cabin like a wire pulled taut. Passengers stirred. Heads turned. Tension shifted again, away from Darren and toward the crew. Then, from across the aisle, Jalen finally spoke. "I saw him touch the seatbelt," he said, his voice clear but uncertain. "Twice, without reason." The effect was instant. A ripple passed through the row. Corvin faltered. Merrick's jaw tightened. The control they had presumed absolute was cracking. Darren didn't wait for them to recover. He turned, addressed the aisle, and said clearly, "I'd like to request the captain's presence." No panic, just precision. Passengers were no longer passive. Some looked between each other. A few nodded. The tide was shifting, and the crew felt it. Corvin gave Merrick a sharp glance, then reached up and pressed a button on his earpiece. Whatever came next would be reactionary. But Darren had already made his move. He had seized initiative. Not through aggression, through evidence, through strategy, through calm, deliberate control. Because he understood now, they weren't testing his reactions. They were testing how far they could go before someone broke, and he wasn't the one breaking. Darren realized the crew wasn't stopping until something broke. Merrick leaned down again, this time slower, deliberate in his gesture, masked under the pretense of a routine compliance check. His fingertips hovered near the infant seatbelt, eyes narrowing slightly as if gauging the right moment. Then, just as Darren adjusted Riven's blanket with his left hand, Merrick made his move, reaching with practiced ease to tamper with the latch a second time. But this time, Darren was ready. Without hesitation, he lifted his right hand, not abrupt or threatening, but firm and direct, and intercepted Merrick's fingers before they could make contact. The subtle motion was enough to draw attention from nearby passengers. "That's enough," Darren said, his voice low but unflinching, his expression devoid of anger but charged with unmistakable resolve. "You're not touching this belt again." Merrick's practiced smile faltered for the first time. A shadow of irritation crossed his face, quick and sharp like a flicker of exposed circuitry behind a polished interface. He straightened without a word, tapping twice on the earpiece nestled discreetly under his right ear. It was a signal. A moment later, the mood in the cabin shifted like the sudden drop in pressure before a storm. From the front galley, Corvin Hale emerged. His gait was firmer now, more official, and his eyes locked onto Darren as if reading from a script. Passengers in the adjacent rows began turning their heads, curiosity blooming across their faces. Corvin stopped just beside Merrick and cleared his throat. "Sir," he said, his tone overly formal, "you are currently impeding standard safety procedures and refusing compliance with crew instructions. We will have to escalate this if you continue." The lie sat thick in the air. Darren didn't move. He simply looked at Corvin, long enough to let silence hang, long enough for others to begin wondering who was really telling the truth. Then he calmly adjusted his grip on Riven and said, "If you believe safety was your priority, you wouldn't have removed the seatbelt during takeoff, and I wouldn't be the only one with a recording of it." Merrick blinked. A flicker of surprise broke through his guarded demeanor. He hadn't anticipated that. Dramatic irony charged the air like static, while the crew believed they were tightening control. The real control had already begun slipping away. They were acting from confidence. Darren was acting from truth. In row 18C, Jalen Trask stood up. His voice was shaky but loud enough to carry. "I saw it," he said. "I saw him undo the seatbelt twice. The father didn't do anything wrong." The words shattered the constructed illusion. Passengers turned fully now, whispering, repositioning. One man leaned out into the aisle, angling for a better view. A woman clutched her coat closer, sensing that the situation had cracked open. Even Corvin's eyes flinched. His stance, though still rigid, betrayed a sudden uncertainty. This wasn't going according to plan. Merrick clenched his jaw and signaled toward the cockpit, a stiff motion, almost desperate. Darren didn't need to know the exact code behind the gesture. He recognized it from his systems analysis training. This was escalation. Step 4 in an interaction matrix designed to provoke maximum compliance through pressure and control. But Darren had spent his career learning how to see pressure systems, and this one was leaking from every seam. Still holding Riven securely in his left arm, he unbuckled his seatbelt with his right and stood, smooth and unthreatening. He turned slightly to make sure multiple rows could see both him and the infant, his actions calm and methodical. "I request to speak to the captain," he said, his voice clear and projected, so no one could mistake the tone. "Now!" A pulse ran through the cabin like a low-frequency vibration. Passengers felt it, not from the engines but from the shift in tone. This was no longer about seatbelts or procedure. It was about control, and whether a system would get away with violating a child's safety under the illusion of authority. Corvin took a step forward, but Darren raised a hand, not to resist, but to emphasize peace. "You've made your position clear," he said evenly. "But I will not allow my son's safety to be compromised. Not again. I have evidence. I have witnesses. If you choose to escalate this, understand that your actions are already documented." The firmness of his words pressed against the walls like expanding pressure. The hum of the aircraft seemed to grow louder, the cabin lights more intense. The energy had changed. Passengers looked from one another to the crew, unsure of where this would go next. A few pulled out their phones. One began quietly recording. Corvin hesitated. Merrick shifted, then stepped back. The script was faltering. Darren stayed exactly where he was, upright, centered, steady, with Riven gently stirring in his arm and the truth cradled in silence. He had been pushed, prodded, cornered, but now it was his move. This time, Darren decided the next move would be his, not theirs. Captain Aaron Valek emerged from the cockpit just as the latest pocket of turbulence passed through the cabin, his hand gripping the edge of the doorframe for balance. The tension in the air was immediate, an invisible wire pulled taut between the authority he represented and the confusion rippling through the aisle. His face was pale, drawn tight with concern, as if the briefing he had received through his earpiece didn't align with what he was now seeing firsthand. Passengers turned to look at him, their eyes filled with expectation and unease. Some leaned into the aisle to get a better view. Others simply watched from behind half-drawn tray tables, caught in the unnerving silence that followed. Merrick Vaughn didn't waste a second. He stepped forward with the mechanical readiness of someone who had rehearsed a particular narrative. "Captain," he began, his tone composed but brisk, "we've had a passenger interfering with cabin safety protocols. He's refused multiple instructions and appears agitated. I believe immediate intervention is necessary." His words were crisp, delivered with practiced confidence, but they were also carefully designed to get ahead of the truth. Darren Velrock stood silently near his seat, his infant son Riven held securely in one arm. He didn't interrupt. Instead, he waited, deliberately, methodically, until Merrick finished speaking. Then, without raising his voice, he extended his other hand and tapped the screen on his wrist device. A clear, live video feed appeared. The screen showed several uninterrupted minutes of cabin footage, starting from the moment Merrick had leaned over and unlatched the baby's seatbelt during takeoff. No overlays, no edits, just raw, time-stamped truth. Captain Aaron stared at the footage. For a few seconds, his face betrayed nothing, but then his eyes widened, subtly, and his breathing slowed. He took a half-step closer, focusing in on the image of Merrick's hand lifting the belt buckle during the plane's acceleration. A child, unsecured, wobbling in turbulence, and a father reacting not with panic, but with protection. "Sir," Darren said, his voice calm, "this footage has been recording since the moment the first interference occurred. I believe you've been given a different version of what happened." Merrick interjected quickly, waving a hand toward the screen. "That's out of context," he said. "He wasn't complying with procedure, and the belt wasn't correctly fastened." Multiple passengers murmured then. A few nodded toward Darren. One man, a few rows back, muttered just loud enough to be heard, "I saw you touch the belt. Twice." The dramatic irony hung in the air like fog. The crew had relied on the assumption that no one would challenge the official version mid-flight. That assumption had already crumbled. Darren's preparation, his recordings, his patience, had begun to unravel the script they thought he was trapped inside. Captain Aaron looked at Merrick sharply now, his jaw tight. "An unrestrained infant during takeoff," he said quietly. "That's not a policy issue. That's a federal violation." Merrick shifted his weight but said nothing. Beside him, Corvin Hale lingered near the galley, arms crossed tightly, watching with eyes that now flickered with uncertainty rather than dominance. For a moment, no one moved. Then the plane jolted again. Not violently, but enough to rock the overhead bins and cause passengers to instinctively grasp their armrests. Aaron flinched visibly, then frowned, glancing upward as if something about the timing didn't sit right. Darren caught it. "You didn't expect that turbulence," he said, low enough for only Aaron to hear. The captain didn't reply, but the crease in his brow deepened. Slowly, he turned to Merrick. "Step aside," he ordered, his voice suddenly firmer. "We'll talk further in a moment." Merrick hesitated, his posture rigid. His eyes darted not to Aaron, but somewhere past him, toward the rear galley, or perhaps to an unseen signal. The delay in his response was slight, but meaningful. Darren saw it, too. He didn't need to understand who Merrick was silently waiting on to recognize that authority on this flight had fractured. Merrick wasn't following airline chain of command. He was waiting for something else, someone else. A ripple of unease passed through Darren's chest. The situation was larger than the actions of one rogue attendant. Something deeper, more coordinated, was operating behind these gestures and deflections. The turbulence, the silent communications between crew, the carefully timed provocations, they weren't accidents. And now, even the captain's reaction hinted that this wasn't the standard chain of events. Passengers whispered again. One woman in the second row murmured to her husband, "Why would someone undo a baby's seatbelt?" The answer didn't come from anyone, but the question hung there, a sign that the doubt had fully shifted. Aaron stood straighter, his voice measured but clipped. "This matter is not closed, and it won't be handled behind closed doors." Merrick's jaw tensed, but he said nothing. The confidence had drained from his expression. Whatever sense of immunity he believed he had was slipping through his fingers. Darren exhaled slowly, adjusting ribbon slightly in his arm. The baby, despite the tension, remained calm, sensing perhaps the security in his father's hold. Every movement Darren made now felt like a statement, not of rebellion, but of presence, control, truth. He didn't need to shout. He had the evidence, the quiet support of the passengers, and now a crack in the command structure that proved the crew wasn't operating alone. This confrontation hadn't ended the threat, but it had torn a hole straight through the veil, hiding it. Something was happening beneath the ordinary routine of flight operations, something unauthorized, something invasive. And Darren was finally close enough to see the outlines forming in the dark. The truth was no longer a secret. It was a spark waiting to ignite. A soft tone pinged from the intercom. There was no announcement, no crackle of the captain's voice, just silence, as if the sound had been a mistake, except it wasn't. Captain Aaron Valek's brow furrowed. He turned his head slightly toward the cockpit door, then glanced at Merrick Vaughn, who stood rigid near the forward galley. Without a word, Aaron excused himself and moved briskly toward the cockpit, his steps tight, like a man realizing the floor beneath him might not be what it seemed. Merrick's eyes followed him with an unreadable intensity. Then, as soon as the captain disappeared behind the door, he turned to Corvin Hale and leaned in close, his voice low but deliberate. "Protocol Tier 3. The phrase was quiet, but not quiet enough to escape Darren Velrock's hearing. He heard it as clearly as if it had been shouted, and his mind instantly parsed the meaning. That wasn't normal crew language. That wasn't about refreshments or seatbelt status. That was coded, formal, and urgent. It wasn't meant for passengers and definitely not meant to be overheard, but it had been. Darren's stomach turned. Corvin didn't respond with words. Instead, he nodded once, subtly, like a soldier receiving orders in the field. Then he stepped forward and tapped a recessed panel near the bulkhead. The aisle lights dimmed in response, casting the cabin in an eerie twilight that made every shadow stretch longer than it should. Passengers looked up. A few shifted uncomfortably. One older man in row 19 peered at the ceiling as if trying to understand why the light above him had flickered. A young father in the back tried to soothe his fussy toddler as the sudden darkness made the child whimper. It wasn't panic yet, but the edges of fear were beginning to form. Darren's grip on Riven tightened instinctively. His eyes swept the cabin. The atmosphere had changed again, Muted, suspicious, charged. Merrick remained near the galley, arms behind his back, chin lifted like he was expecting the next act in a performance. Corvin moved with clinical precision, stopping briefly near the flight attendant jump seat, tapping into a device Darren hadn't noticed earlier. None of it felt normal. And then came the twist. Jalen Trask, the quiet passenger who had previously spoken up to defend Darren, shifted forward in his seat, his face pale. He cleared his throat once, then louder, drawing the attention of those nearby. I know what that phrase means, he said shakily. Heads turned. Merrick's did not. Jalen stood, hands trembling slightly. I used to work for a compliance audit firm. We monitored airlines on behalf of third-party partners. Protocol Tier 3 wasn't about safety. It was part of a framework used in covert behavior assessments, specifically to escalate and contain a subject showing non-compliant stress resistance. The cabin fell into stunned silence. A paper cup rolled down the aisle and stopped beneath a seat. "You're saying this is a test?" a passenger near row 15 asked. Jalen nodded slowly. Not an airline test. A contractor test. Behavior modeling. Passenger psychology under stress. Murmurs spread like sparks across dry grass. Darren's heartbeat quickened. His mind locked onto a new realization. Merrick and Corvin weren't following airline safety policy. They were following a script. A script written by someone else. By someone who didn't care that Riven had nearly been thrown from his seat during takeoff. Who had calculated every move to study Darren's response like he was some rat in a cage. Darren turned to Jalen. "Stay close," he said under his breath. "If this gets worse, I need another voice they can't ignore." Jalen gave a short nod and sat again, eyes wide with unease. Meanwhile, at the front of the cabin, Merrick and Corvin were huddled near the jump seat console. Their posture now visibly different, tense, clipped, urgent. Corvin's jaw twitched. Merrick's fingers danced over the control panel again, and the lights above row 13 blinked twice in succession. Another signal. Darren recognized the cues. This wasn't random. This was sequencing. A set of rehearsed conditions meant to push him to the edge. And now, with Jalen's revelation, the motives behind those moves were undeniable. He looked around the cabin again. The baby, 2 rows back, had started crying. A woman in her 30s leaned in to whisper to her partner, glancing nervously toward the front. Something was building, and Darren could feel it rising. Then Merrick turned, walking slowly back toward Darren's row with measured steps. "Sir," he said in a voice that feigned authority, "due to your continued non-compliance with safety instructions, you are being informed that you may need to be restrained for the safety of the cabin." Several passengers gasped. Darren didn't move. His voice came low, but steady. "Is that a threat?" Merrick didn't answer. "Because if it is," Darren continued, "you'd better be sure your policy manual backs it up." He shifted Riven gently in his arms, tucking the baby's head against his shoulder, then calmly reached for his phone. With a swipe, he made the recording live viewable and tilted it so a few nearby passengers could see the footage. Merrick's face appeared on screen, removing Riven's belt during takeoff. One of the passengers in row 14 hissed under his breath. "That's not right." Darren stood slowly, controlled, grounded, Riven asleep against his chest, completely unaware of the storm building around him. "You're not just provoking a parent," Darren said to Merrick. "You're provoking a cabin of witnesses. And I promise you, whatever this system is, it won't shield you when it collapses." Merrick's mouth opened slightly, but no words came. Behind him, Corvin hesitated, clearly unsure whether to move forward or hold back. The tide had shifted, but Darren knew they weren't done yet. He had seen enough patterns to know that systems like this always had one last attempt at control, one last button to push. He lowered his voice, speaking more to himself than anyone else as he stared directly at Merrick. Darren realized he was not just protecting his son. He was exposing a hidden system. Captain Aaron Valek reappeared from the cockpit with a stiffness that hadn't been there before. His steps were slow, his gaze strangely distant, and his hands trembled ever so slightly at his sides. He avoided Merrick's eyes completely, a subtle but telling shift in the dynamic. Darren noticed immediately. Something had changed. Something serious. Aaron approached, his voice lower than usual. "Mr. Velrock," he said, pausing as though the words were difficult to form. "May I speak with you near the galley?" Before Darren could answer, Merrick stepped forward almost instinctively. "Captain, with respect, I don't think—" "Not a request," Aaron cut in, his voice sharp enough to still the air between them. "You'll remain here." The authority in his tone left no room for challenge. Merrick's mouth hung open for a second before he stepped back, jaw tight, hands clenched behind his back. Darren, still cradling his sleeping son, followed the captain toward the galley without a word, though his mind was already preparing for the worst. Once they were out of immediate earshot, surrounded by the quiet hum of refrigeration units and overhead vents, Aaron turned to him, his eyes bloodshot and narrowed with unease. "There's something you need to know," he whispered. "The system logs. Several of them have been overridden." Darren's breath caught. Overridden by who? Aaron hesitated, as if saying it aloud made it more real. "The override code reads as VPX-rail. It's tied to Virulon passenger systems." Darren's eyes sharpened. Jalen had named that contractor not long ago. "You're saying this wasn't authorized?" "No," Aaron shook his head. "Not by me, and not by the airline. I checked the route protocols. This flight was never cleared for testing, but the contractor's code is embedded in the cabin systems, manipulating them." Darren blinked, struggling to contain the storm building behind his eyes. "The turbulence." "Artificially triggered," Aaron confirmed, voice grim. "They've been cycling pressure modulations through the ventilation system. Microbursts. Just enough to rattle nerves, especially those holding infants." Darren exhaled slowly, his mind shifting from shock to precision. "They're running a stress test." "Yes," Aaron admitted, "and we're all part of it. The crew, they don't know, at least not fully. They think they're participating in some behavioral trial, but this is deeper, more dangerous." A flash of static rolled through the ceiling speaker, a quick, unannounced ping. Darren looked up, his instincts flaring. "We need to move before they escalate." The captain nodded. "Agreed, but if we confront them outright—" "No chaos," Darren interrupted softly. "We expose it, publicly, with witnesses." Footsteps approached. Merrick emerged from the aisle, slow and deliberate. He didn't speak, but his stare bore into the two of them like he already knew what they were plotting. Behind him, Corvin Hale appeared, arms crossed, expression unreadable. The two attendants walked toward them with the purposeful gait of men carrying out instructions. Not moral ones, operational ones. As if protocol had replaced their judgment. Darren turned slightly, adjusting ribbon in his arm, his heart pounding but his face calm. He knew this moment. He had seen it play out in models before, scenarios where escalation became inevitable once the script reached a certain line. But this wasn't theory. This was real. And his son was the variable no system could predict. "We need to speak with you, sir," Corvin said coolly, his tone lacking all empathy. Darren didn't answer immediately. He glanced down the aisle and saw passengers beginning to notice. Jalen sat upright again. Redden Varos, the tall man near the emergency exit, stood partially, sensing the tension. Darren met Corvin's eyes, then Merrick's. "Before you say another word," he said, his voice firm and steady, "you should see this." He lifted his arm, tapping the side of his wrist device. A soft chime rang out and the screen lit up, displaying a frozen frame of Merrick's earlier interaction with the seatbelt, the moment his hand unclasped it during takeoff. The resolution was crisp, the timestamp undeniable. Merrick's jaw twitched. Corvin narrowed his eyes. "You're not authorized to record." "I'm a father," Darren replied, "and I'm protecting my child." The device glowed brightly in the dim cabin light. Around them, passengers stirred. Murmurs spread. A woman gasped audibly when she recognized the image on the screen. Someone began filming on their own phone. Aaron took a step forward and addressed the cabin in a loud, clear voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, I need your attention. This flight may have been compromised by an unauthorized third-party system operating without the airline's consent. Please remain seated and calm while we verify and take appropriate action." Gasps followed. Whispers turned to hushed arguments. Merrick moved fast, stepping forward again, but this time Darren didn't retreat. Instead, he pivoted slightly so every passenger had a clear view of the evidence. His voice carried now, not in anger, but in undeniable clarity. "This flight is being controlled by an unauthorized contractor, and the evidence is right here." The attendant smirked, confident his reckless act would go unchallenged, unaware that every move, every camera, and every second had already been anticipated by a father who doesn't tolerate endangerment. If you believe cruelty under a uniform always folds when strategy meets unstoppable power, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. Merrick lunged forward, his hand slicing through the narrow space between seats as he reached for Darren's phone. The sudden motion jolted the surrounding passengers. Gasps erupted, but Merrick didn't flinch. His eyes were locked on the device like it was a threat that needed neutralizing. Darren instinctively turned his shoulder, shielding both the phone and his son with one controlled pivot, his free arm holding Riven tighter, a barrier between the chaos and the child who had no idea how dangerous this flight had become. "Don't touch him," Jalen Trask shouted, his voice cracking as he shoved himself out of his aisle seat. His stance was unsteady, but his eyes were locked with Merrick's. "You're not taking anything from him. That phone holds evidence." Merrick's breath hitched, caught off guard by the resistance. But before he could respond, another passenger rose, taller, broader, and far more commanding. "Step back," said Redden Veros, his deep voice rumbling with restrained fury. He moved into the aisle like a wall, planting himself between Corvin Hale and the rest of the cabin. "You endangered a baby. You're not touching anyone." Corvin's stride faltered. His lips parted as if to speak, but nothing came. The momentum the crew had carefully engineered, step by step, interaction by interaction, had shattered in seconds. This was no longer a controlled test. This was a revolt. Captain Aaron, emerging from the cockpit, raised a hand in an attempt to restore order, but before a single word left his mouth, the cabin lights flickered. Not a casual flicker, an unnatural, synchronized pulse, as if a silent command had been issued across a system meant to remain dormant. Then came the voice. "VPX monitoring active. Continue observation." The announcement slithered from the intercom with sterile precision. It was not a crew member's voice, not a human's, not anything the passengers had heard before. Cold, automated, unmistakably external. Captain Aaron turned pale. "What was that?" he whispered, eyes darting to the speaker. Merrick took a half-step back, his face suddenly unsure. Corvin looked at him in disbelief as if to ask whether he knew about this, and Merrick's silence said everything. Darren's heart pounded. That single phrase confirmed the worst. This wasn't just a scripted behavioral experiment. The system was active. The contractor was live monitoring them. He rose fully, holding Riven in one arm while lifting the phone high with the other, turning toward the nearest passenger with a screen large enough to mirror the footage. "Can I cast this?" he asked. The man, shaking, nodded quickly and turned his device outward. Within seconds, the footage played. Merrick unbuckling Riven during takeoff. Darren's calm resistance, the whispered codes, the calculated timing of turbulence. The passengers saw it all. Whispers gave way to gasps. Outrage sharpened like a blade. "You took off his seatbelt?" someone cried. "He could have been hurt." "This wasn't a test. This was abuse." Darren's voice cut through the noise, steady and focused. Captain, this system is overriding your controls. We need to shut it down manually from the service bay. Aaron, still staring at the speaker, didn't argue. He nodded slowly. Where exactly? Darren pointed toward the narrow panel near the front of the cabin, beneath the crew's emergency storage. Access panel under the avionics hatch. We'll need to disable the cabin control relay manually. Merrick, regaining some of his composure, barked, "You don't have the authority." But no one was listening anymore. Passengers were on their feet, some recording, others stepping into the aisles to ensure Merrick and Corvin couldn't interfere. Redden didn't move, his arms crossed, standing like a shield between the crew and the child. Jalen hovered behind Darren, ready to back him if anything went wrong. The crew's illusion of control had crumbled completely. The roles had reversed. The experiment meant to measure fear had birthed defiance. Dramatic irony filled every inch of the cabin. Those tasked with orchestrating the reaction had provoked something they couldn't contain. As the passengers watched the footage loop a second time, Captain Aaron led Darren toward the front of the cabin. The pilot moved stiffly, like someone walking into a room they once understood but no longer recognized. He tapped in a code to unlock the panel, his fingers trembling slightly. Merrick stood frozen behind them, his authority drained, his uniform now just fabric instead of power. He opened his mouth again, then closed it, eyes fixed on the mirrored footage playing for all to see. Darren adjusted his grip on Riven, who shifted softly in his arms, unaware of the storm around him. The child's breath was calm, a steady rhythm against his father's chest. It gave Darren clarity, strength. As he followed the captain toward the access point, his eyes swept once more across the stunned passengers, the fractured crew, and the screens still flickering with the truth. This was never about a seatbelt. It was about control, and who had the right to it. He tightened his hold on both his son and the device, because the next move was no longer theirs. The moment the intercom spoke, everyone finally understood this was no ordinary flight. Captain Aaron Valek twisted the latch and pulled open the narrow service bay access panel beside the cockpit. A metallic hiss escaped as the seal released. The dim compartment inside, lit by the glow of a diagnostic screen, immediately seized Darren Velrock's attention. And then he saw it. On the active display, pulsing in cold blue light, were live readouts labeled Response Intensity, Parental Stress Factor, and Passenger Resistance Metrics. Lines danced and recalibrated in real time, tracking data points with precision that felt invasive, clinical. Darren's breath caught. This wasn't just a surveillance tool. It was a psychological framework built to read, escalate, and shape human behavior mid-flight. Aaron's brow furrowed as he leaned closer. "This isn't airline issued," he muttered, his voice dry with disbelief. "This isn't even on our experimental systems list." Darren's eyes swept the screen again, sharper now. In the corner of the display pulsed a blinking alert. Escalation protocol queued. Level 2. Disruption. Imminent. Awaiting lockdown authorization. He inhaled sharply. "They're about to trigger a lockdown," he said. "Cabin doors will seal, and this flight will be flagged as hostile." Aaron looked at him, the blood draining from his face. "Who's doing this?" Darren pointed to a code signature looping in the corner. VPX-rail. His voice dropped. "Virulon Passenger Systems. It's embedded in the relay firmware. They've been running this operation remotely." The implications hit both men at once. This wasn't a rogue test. It was a full-scale behavioral experiment being conducted without the knowledge or consent of the airline, the crew, or the passengers. And now it was set to escalate. "Captain," Darren said firmly, "we need to disconnect the relay. Now." Aaron hesitated, his eyes darting to a second panel below the screen. "If we sever that link, we could lose cabin pressure readings, oxygen routing, even galley power." Darren didn't flinch. "And if we don't, they'll control every second of this flight, including whether it lands." The captain's jaw tightened. For a long moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the active system. Then Aaron reached forward and unlocked the access latch, revealing the relay cluster behind it. Thin cables ran like veins into a glowing interface, its light flickering with each signal sent. Darren rolled up his sleeve and stepped forward. His hands moved with measured urgency, guided by instinct and experience. He bypassed the primary routing and identified the auxiliary input, the one carrying external control commands. The locking mechanism buzzed. Sparks cracked as he disconnected the main line. For a second, the entire bay seemed to hold its breath. And then, silence. In the main cabin behind them, the change was instant. The faint turbulence ceased. Lights stopped flickering. The overhead screens shifted back to default airline displays. Even the temperature steadied. Every system, previously distorted or manipulated, snapped back into normalcy, as if a ghost had been exorcised. A voice rang out from the aisle. "What did you do?" It was Merrick. He stood several rows back, fists clenched, his voice high with panic. "What did you do to the system?" But no one responded. No one needed to. Darren didn't turn around. He remained focused on the screen, which now displayed a static red banner. Control link severed. External command denied. He slowly looked down at Riven in his arms. The boy slept, undisturbed, the calm innocence of a child who had no idea how close danger had come. Darren swallowed hard. For all his calculated restraint, he now allowed himself a single breath of relief. They had stopped the immediate threat, but the system that allowed it still needed to be exposed. He turned to Aaron. "We need to document this override, everything. The readings, the code, the escalation command. If we don't have it recorded, they'll deny this ever happened." The captain nodded slowly, as if emerging from a fog. His voice was quiet but resolute. "I'll draft the report myself, and I'll submit the system logs to Aviation Command with your evidence attached." The moment felt still, heavy with truth. For the first time in hours, the aircraft belonged to its rightful operators again. Pilots, not programmers. People, not protocols. And as the cabin settled into an uneasy calm, Darren cradled Riven close, his thoughts already reaching ahead to what had to come next. They had disrupted the system's control, but to hold anyone accountable, they would need indisputable proof. He didn't smile. He didn't relax. But he knew what mattered most had been preserved. The threat had been exposed, but proof would determine what happened next. The moment the contractor's system was severed, a strange silence fell over the cabin, as if the aircraft itself had exhaled. The turbulence stopped. The lights steadied. The faint electronic whine in the air dulled, replaced by the more familiar hum of stabilized engines. Darren Velrock stood with his son Riven tucked safely in his arm, his body still braced for aftershocks that didn't come. For the first time since the wheels left the ground, control had returned to human hands. Merrick Vaughn was the first to break the silence, though his voice lacked its earlier bite. I didn't know it would act on its own," he muttered, eyes darting to Captain Aaron and then to the flickering service panel where the override logs had just been disconnected. He took a hesitant step forward, then stopped, glancing at the passengers who now stared at him, not with curiosity, but with open distrust. Corvin Hale, flustered and flushed, tried to regain some authority. "We were only following protocol. The training said these evaluations were approved. We thought—" He caught himself, as though realizing how hollow the defense sounded with a baby's safety now part of the collateral. He looked to Aaron, searching for backup, but found none. The captain remained beside Darren, his silence a signal of where his loyalty had shifted. The passengers weren't silent anymore. Murmurs grew louder, some expressing disbelief, others outright anger. Several passengers pointed fingers toward Merrick, questioning how anyone could justify tampering with a child's safety, regardless of who issued the order. Darren, however, didn't join the anger. He stood still, eyes sharp, his voice calm. "We don't win anything by yelling," he said evenly, looking at those around him. "But we do win if the truth is preserved. That's what matters now." He turned to Jalen Trask, who had been quietly observing from a nearby seat, his tablet still cradled in one hand. "You said you worked compliance for audit systems," Darren asked. Jalen nodded. 4 years with a subcontractor for airport logistics. Viralan's name came up a few times, always buried behind generic system labels. They test thresholds, not policies. His voice faltered with a mix of regret and conviction. "I never thought I'd see it unfold live." "Then I need a statement from you," Darren said. "Everything you saw, everything you know. You too, Mr. Veros." Redden Veros, the tall man who had physically blocked Corvin during the earlier clash, stepped closer, his frame casting a long shadow over the row. He undid the baby's seatbelt. I saw it clearly. No turbulence, no mistake. Deliberate. His tone carried the weight of someone who didn't tolerate cowardice. Passengers began nodding. One by one, they offered to submit their statements. One recorded the exchange. Another replayed footage from their phone that captured Merrick's second approach to Darren's seat. The evidence was multiplying, and Darren was collecting it all. "Send your copies to this secure key," Darren instructed, showing a small interface on his wrist device. "End-to-end encrypted. I'll upload everything to a protected archive. We can't let a single piece disappear." Captain Aaron stepped forward then, his expression stern but grounded. "I'll back his account. The override was unauthorized. The turbulence was being induced. I saw the interface myself." He turned to Merrick and Corvin. "If either of you want a chance to explain, start with honesty. Now." Merrick looked away. Corvin stared at the floor. No one spoke. As the aircraft began its descent toward Raylan Field under emergency clearance, Aaron handed full operational authority to the first officer and stayed with Darren. "You and I," he said quietly, "will tell them what really happened, not the version Viralan expects." But Darren remained uneasy. His instincts, finely tuned through years of risk assessment, told him the contractor wouldn't just let this unravel without a failsafe. He scanned the cabin again. That was when he saw him. A man in the back row. Quiet, unassuming. Trim beard, slate gray suit. A black badge partially tucked inside his coat. Too discreet for a normal passenger ID. Too deliberate for chance. He wasn't watching the crew. He was watching the reactions. Darren didn't alert anyone. Not yet. Timing was everything. Instead, he tapped once more into his hidden protocol, triggering a secure multi-device upload of all recordings, images, audio, and metadata gathered since takeoff. The signal jumped between encrypted relays. A backup archive, location neutral, untraceable. If someone tried to erase it later, it would survive in at least 6 secure mirrors. As the plane began its final descent, the cabin dimmed softly, casting golden light across the tension-lined faces of every man present. The crew was broken. The captain was alert. The truth was out. But the real opponent, Darren realized, had never worn a uniform. He turned toward Riven and adjusted the blanket around the child's shoulder. The baby slept on, unaware of how close danger had crept. Darren's eyes flicked once more toward the quiet man in the back row. The truth was safe, but the battle was far from finished. The aircraft touched down with a controlled thud, tires kissing the tarmac with just enough force to remind every soul on board that they had survived something far from ordinary. Before the engines could fully spool down, blue and white Aeronex Safety Division vehicles raced toward the plane, their lights flashing in urgent staccato, illuminating the fuselage with flickering streaks. No one had called them. No one had expected them. But they were here. Within moments, the forward cabin door was opened manually by the first officer, and the mobile staircase was wheeled into place with near-military efficiency. The tension inside the aircraft had thickened, not loosened. The crew, once so assertive, now stood hollow-eyed and stiff. Merrick Vaughn kept his gaze low, fingers clasped behind his back. Corvin Hale fidgeted near the galley, glancing between the cockpit and the front row. Passengers remained seated but alert, some gripping armrests, others whispering with wide eyes. It felt like a jury waiting for a verdict. Boots struck the cabin floor. Director Kalen Voss entered first. He was tall, square-shouldered, mid-40s, and wore his reputation like armor. Known throughout the airline industry for his zero-tolerance stance on policy manipulation, Kalen surveyed the interior of the plane with a slow, deliberate gaze. He didn't speak right away. His eyes moved from the first row to the last, noting the expressions of the crew, the silent stares of the passengers, and the one man who stood out, Darren Velrock, holding his son with calm, unshakable resolve. Kalen turned to Captain Aaron Valek, who met him halfway down the aisle with a heavy expression. Without wasting time, Aaron delivered a concise summary: unauthorized behavioral experiments, overridden systems, and a tampered infant seatbelt during takeoff. Kalen's jaw tensed mid-report. "You're saying the flight crew acted under false protocols?" he asked, voice like a gavel. "Yes, sir, but there's more," Aaron replied. "Passenger Velrock has recordings. Evidence. It's worse than protocol deviation. It's endangerment." Kalen's attention snapped to Darren. "Mr. Velrock." Darren stepped forward without hesitation. Riven stirred softly against his shoulder but remained asleep. "I have everything documented. The seatbelt tampering, the intercom override, the escalation sequence, it's all here," he said, holding out a secure drive. Kalen took it with gloved hands and inserted it into a portable reader clipped to his side. As the footage played on a small screen, his eyebrows furrowed. 10 seconds in, he pressed pause. His voice dropped to a low command. "Seal the aircraft. No one leaves. No one erases anything." Gasps rippled through the cabin, but no one objected. Not even the crew. Just then, as if cued by some hidden script, a man from the rear of the plane quietly stood. He wore a dark charcoal suit and carried no luggage. His face had been largely unnoticed until now, but something about him radiated control, a confidence that didn't match the panic in the cabin. He approached slowly, holding out a card. "I'm with Travel Analytics," he announced smoothly. "I can explain everything. This was a sanctioned study." Kalen didn't even glance at the card. "No, you're not," he said. "And that badge, Viralan format. You're with the contractor." The man's lips parted in a half-denial. "It's not what you think. We had clearance." "You had nothing," Kalen cut in, voice hardening. "There's no approved authorization for live behavioral audits on this flight, not from the FAA, not from Aeronex, and certainly not from me." Security officers surged forward without waiting for a signal. The man tried to object, but he was already being escorted away. Passengers applauded, a soft ripple of relief that someone in authority had finally seen the truth and acted. Merrick slumped back against the bulkhead, stunned. His smirk was gone, his jaw slack. "I didn't know," he muttered, not to anyone in particular. I thought we were helping evaluate protocols." Corvin turned pale. "They said he was flagged as resistant," he whispered, referring to Darren. "They said we were just monitoring him, that the child was just part of the variable." Those words hung in the air like smoke. Darren didn't gloat. He didn't lash out. He simply held his son tighter, watching the cracks split through the lie the crew had believed. It wasn't about one father's resistance. It was about a system that had trained people to obey instructions without asking who wrote them. Kalen turned back toward the cockpit, expression steeled. "We'll need every system log, every crew statement, and all passenger footage." "You'll have it," Darren said, calm but resolute. The rest of the passengers watched as truth, long distorted, found its shape again under the pressure of evidence and clarity. For the first time since takeoff, the plane felt like it had truly landed. The hidden observer was gone. The crew's script was in shambles, and every lie told in the name of control was unraveling fast. The landing marked the end of the flight, but the beginning of consequences. The door to the secure investigation lounge at Raylan Field slid shut with a hiss, sealing the chaos of the tarmac behind it. Inside, the fluorescent lights cast a sterile glow over the room's metallic surfaces. Darren Velrock lowered himself into a firm chair, his arms wrapped protectively around his sleeping son, Riven, whose head rested against his chest. The boy's soft breaths were a stark contrast to the whirlwind of violations, fear, and manipulation that had unfolded just hours earlier. Across from him, Director Kalen Voss stood tall, his slate-gray suit creased from travel but his expression sharp and alert. He tapped his datapad as statements trickled in from each passenger, crew member, and technical officer who had been on Aeronex Flight 719. Kalen didn't waste time. "We have verified the preliminary evidence," he said, voice clipped and devoid of emotion. "Mr. Velrock, your footage, combined with the captain's testimony, has exposed a breach far deeper than anticipated." Darren nodded silently, his thoughts still anchored to the moment Merrick Vaughn first reached for the infant seatbelt. That single motion, disguised as protocol, had unraveled something monstrous. He kept one hand against Riven's back, drawing calm from the baby's warmth. The weight of what had been risked and what had been stopped pressed heavily against his ribs. Kalen continued, stepping toward a digital wall display where images from the investigation scrolled past. Cabin telemetry logs, seat assignment patterns, and internal communications from the crew. Virlan Passenger Systems inserted experimental behavioral software into multiple Aeronex aircraft without central authorization. They used psychological triggers to study parental response under artificial stress. He turned to Darren. "You were not randomly chosen. You were profiled. Seat 17A was flagged weeks ago for the Infant Risk Contingency Module." Darren clenched his jaw, eyes flicking toward the panel showing a ghostly heat map of cabin stress fluctuations. "They endangered my child to collect data." "Yes," Kalen replied, "and the crew didn't know the full scope. They were used as conduits, blindly following scripts laced into their daily briefings." At that moment, Merrick Vaughn stepped hesitantly into the room. Gone was the crisp professionalism, the smug control. His uniform was wrinkled, his gaze lowered. For a long pause he stood without speaking, then took a small step forward. "I didn't know," he murmured. "I thought it was a standard compliance drill. I didn't know the system could override the aircraft or that it was live." Darren regarded him without hostility, but with no warmth either. His voice was measured. "You touched my son's seatbelt during takeoff. You lied. You escalated." Merrick swallowed hard, shame etched in every line of his face. "I know. I'm sorry. If I didn't comply, they said my career would be on hold. I wasn't told everything, just that you were resistant, that we needed to document how you'd react. I believed them." There was no need for raised voices. Darren simply nodded once. "You were manipulated, same as the rest of us. The difference is you followed the script." Corvin Hale arrived next, escorted by a junior investigator. His hands trembled slightly as he sat across from Kalen and Darren. "They threatened to suspend me," Corvin said, almost too quietly to hear. "Said if I failed to follow the behavioral escalation tiers, I'd be reassigned. I've got a brother who depends on my salary. I didn't know they were logging biometric spikes. I didn't know about the override codes." Kalen Voss watched both men with a gaze that could slice through stone. "Your confessions will be part of the report. Whether you're complicit or collateral is up to the review board." The weight of what they'd done, and what they hadn't known, settled like dust in the air, unshakable and heavy. Merrick looked at Darren again, eyes bloodshot. "You were never the problem," he said. We were told to monitor someone who wouldn't comply, someone too cautious. They said you'd make the data interesting." "I'm a father," Darren replied, "not a variable." Kalen stepped forward again, placing a hand flat on the table. "Effective immediately. All Virelin passenger systems contracts are suspended. Every trace of their software will be purged from Airnex aircraft. Your footage, Mr. Velrock, will form the spine of a federal review and likely a criminal inquiry." Outside the glass walls, other passengers sat in waiting rooms providing statements. Jalen Trask spoke to an investigator animatedly, pointing toward a diagram of cabin rows. Redden Varos gave a firm handshake to one of the safety agents, visibly frustrated that it had taken this much to be heard. Darren stood slowly, Riven shifting slightly in his arms. "What happens next?" he asked. "We rebuild," Kalen said. "From truth, not control." Darren nodded, but his thoughts were already drifting. Not everyone would have stayed calm. Not every parent would have thought clearly. Some might have panicked, lashed out, or worse. And that's what Virelin had been counting on. The failure of human patience, the breaking point of love under pressure. He looked down at his sleeping son, the boy who had no idea how close he had come to being nothing more than a data point. Then he looked back at Kalen. "This can't be buried." Kalen's reply was immediate. "It won't be." Passengers began filing out of their briefing rooms. Several paused by Darren's side. An older man offered a respectful nod. A younger father shook his hand. Quiet thank yous passed from one to the next, voices heavy with emotion. Darren accepted their words humbly, never letting go of Riven. His thoughts remained steady. It was never about just him. It was about every father who wouldn't have the time to react, every child whose safety might one day be treated as a test. He looked once more at the screen showing the override logs, now sealed, copied, and archived, and understood the depth of the deception. But he also saw how easily that deception unraveled when someone refused to play their part. Justice required more than exposure. It required rebuilding trust. The moment the aircraft touched down at Raylan Field, the runway lights cutting through the early dusk like watchful eyes, the true scale of what had occurred began to unfurl. The air outside hissed against the hull as the brakes engaged, but inside the cabin, silence pressed like a held breath. No one clapped. No one moved. All eyes were on Darren Velrock, still standing in the aisle with Riven tucked securely against his chest, and on the quiet man in the back row, now surrounded. It wasn't over. Not yet. Darren kept his gaze locked forward as the boarding door opened and Director Kalen Voss stepped aboard. Tall, lean, with silver-threaded temples and an intensity that silenced entire rooms, Kalen needed no introduction. His reputation across Aeronex's internal oversight teams was that of a man who treated procedural breaches not just as errors, but as moral failures. As he entered the cabin, he didn't nod or greet the captain. He simply scanned the aisle like a battlefield commander, assessing casualties not in bodies, but in broken protocols. "Captain," he said without looking, "report." Aaron Valek stepped forward immediately, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Unauthorized system override, originating from Virelin passenger systems. Cabin conditions were manipulated. Behavioral pressure testing conducted on a parent and infant, without consent." Kalen turned slowly toward Merrick Vaughn and Corvin Hale. "Did either of you authorize or report such an operation through Aeronex procedural channels?" Merrick opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Corvin, pale and exhausted, murmured, "We were told it was approved. A simulation. Just observation." Kalen's jaw clenched, his voice dropping into something quieter, but colder. "You endangered an infant. You violated protocol. And you undermined the trust of every soul on this aircraft." He pivoted to the passengers. "Did anyone document what occurred?" Darren stepped forward, eyes steady. "I did." Kalen's eyes settled on him now, scanning him as if reading not just his face, but his intent. Name: Darren Velrock, Systems Engineer, Civilian. Do you still have the footage? I made duplicates. Several passengers have it. One is already backed to a secure archive. Without a word, Kalen extended his hand. Darren handed over a drive. As the director viewed the opening clips, his expression changed. The jaw tightened further. His thumb paused on the screen when Merrick was shown reaching for the baby's seatbelt mid-takeoff. A breath caught in his throat, then he gave a single nod. This plane is now under full safety division quarantine. No one disembarks without clearance. That was when the quiet man in the back stood, lifting a slim identification badge. I'm authorized. Travel Data Oversight. But Kalen's voice cut through like steel. That badge is Viralan. You're not oversight. You're embedded surveillance. The man tried to protest, but security was already moving. He didn't resist. There was no point. The moment the contractor's presence was confirmed, murmurs broke out across the cabin, not of panic, but of relief. They hadn't imagined it. This really had happened. Later, inside the investigation lounge, with Riven now asleep against his shoulder and his jacket draped protectively over the infant's body, Darren gave his full account. Kalen listened intently, occasionally tapping notes onto a secure tablet. Merrick sat silently on the far end of the room, no longer defensive, just broken. When the questioning ended, the former flight attendant stood slowly and walked to Darren. I didn't know it would go that far, Merrick said, voice low, defeated. They said it was just observation, that you'd never even realize. Darren studied him for a moment. You removed my son's seatbelt during takeoff. That's not observation. That's endangerment. Merrick nodded once, eyes down. I'm sorry. Darren didn't forgive him, but he nodded back. Then say that to every parent you see for the rest of your life. Corvin Hale was next. His statement revealed something darker. Threats of demotion if he failed to engage in the scenario, bonus incentives for believability, and a hidden training document that described resistance profiles based on passenger behavior. Darren's name had been marked by Viralan's predictive system before he even boarded. His file flagged him as high composure, high paternal protection, a suitable candidate for situational integrity tests. Kalen's face grew harder with each word. This wasn't just a rogue crew, he said aloud to his team. This was systemic infiltration. The final blow came when audit documents revealed the system wasn't isolated to Flight 719. At least 6 other aircraft had active VPX rail modules installed without official authorization. Kalen ordered every one of them grounded. By week's end, Aeronex had issued a public statement. They admitted the breach, acknowledged the unauthorized testing, and suspended all contracts with Viralan Passenger Systems. The industry reeled. News channels played the footage, Darren's footage, on every loop. The image of a baby being held tightly by his father as the seatbelt was removed mid-takeoff became a national symbol of what blind technological trust could cost. Then came the call. Kalen contacted Darren directly. We're forming a civilian oversight board, he said, to rewrite the ethical boundaries around cabin monitoring, AI pressure testing, and behavioral analytics in commercial aviation. We're calling it the Riven Standard. Darren paused. I'm not a policymaker. You're exactly what we need, Kalen replied. You asked the right questions. You didn't panic. You recorded everything. And you didn't stop when they tried to make you doubt what you saw. There was silence between them. Then Darren answered, I'll do it. He joined the board. He sat in meetings where engineers, regulators, and ethicists argued over boundaries. He played the footage again and again for training teams, explaining each failure point, not just the technical breaches, but the human ones. He showed them what happened when systems were trusted more than judgment, when data overruled decency. Weeks later, he stood on the balcony of his apartment, the sun low over the city, casting golden stripes across the floor. Riven rested against his chest, tiny breaths rising and falling in rhythm. A jet passed overhead, smooth and distant, and Darren watched it with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. He had boarded that flight only to return home, to protect his son, to make a presentation the next morning. Instead, he had exposed a threat buried inside the system. And now, because of that, the sky was a little safer. Not because danger was gone, but because people were finally watching. And for the first time since the incident, Darren allowed himself to breathe without fear. The world had changed, because one father refused to remain silent. By the time the plane leveled off, the father had acted, the attendant escorted out, and the crew frozen in disbelief as the lesson in authority became crystal clear. If you believe real authority acts decisively, with precision and unstoppable force, subscribe now, because justice always lands first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores abuse of authority, negligence, and the importance of protecting loved ones. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage accountability, respect, and integrity in all situations.